Okay, thanks, Charles. Sami, if you want. So I'd just like to introduce Sami Zubaida, who is actually a colleague of mine at Birkbeck. And Sami is Emeritus Professor of Politics and Sociology at Birkbeck, and also a fellow, was recently made a fellow of Birkbeck College. Sami was a founder member of the Department of Politics in 1972. Also has quite an interesting background, and even though much younger than Eric Hobsbawm, was brought up, or was born in a sort of ancient Middle Eastern, cosmopolitan Middle Eastern center of learning, in this case Baghdad rather than Alexandria, made his way to Britain, made his way to Birkbeck like Hobsbawm. Sami is the author of quite a number of books, most recently Beyond Islam, A New Understanding of the Middle East. In addition to this, Islam, the People and the State, Political Ideas and Movements in the Middle East. Sami also has a very strong interest in food and politics, and so there's a good book here, A Taste of Time, Culinary Cultures of the Middle East, and also Law and Power in the Islamic World, which is a 2003 book. Sami's given talks at many places around the world, and I just have a note here from just in 2011, amongst his lectures included speaking at Ravenna University in Italy at the International Association of Media and Communication Research Conference, Istanbul, and delivering a keynote lecture at the Arab Thought Forum in Jordan. And with that, Sami,
Thank you, Eric. I've now got to live up to all this, honored by the comparison to Hobsbawm. Well, I'm going to talk about different moments in the development of nationalism in the Middle East, and in terms of the different articulations to different ideologies and outlooks in the course of political modernity from the late 19th century to the present, and then end up with some reflections on what's happening at the present time, particularly with the question of relation to religion. So I'll go through a number of different sort of types of nationalism in terms of articulation to ideologies. First of all, we should consider the proto-nationalism of the imagined universal religious community. This was the nationalism of the traditional strata of the Ottoman and the Iranian world when faced with Western ascendancy from the 19th century. In terms of this paradigm, the world is divided into antagonistic religious communities in which European powers are characterized as Christian and in cahoots with the local Christian populations, and hence the various stages, starting with the Napoleonic conquest of Egypt, of European ascendancy in the Middle East, have seen communal violence and attacks on the Christian communities in these countries. And similarly, the Sunni-Shia division within Islam was then also attributed to the geopolitical division between the Ottoman world and Iran. So, it attributed the weakness against the West to the neglect of religion and of the solidarity of the Muslim Ummah. This was the opposite of the modernist reformist attribution of backwardness to corrupt religion. This Ummah nationalism, as it might be called, continued in the background with special appeal in populist ideologies throughout the modern period, and was revived particularly with great strength in the post-9/11 era. It became a floating discourse in which various groups and various ideas articulated themselves in looking at the world in terms of the confrontation between religious groups, and of course that has its echo in the Western ideas, such as that of the clash of civilizations. Then you have, that's one paradigm, the starting at proto-nationalism of the imagined religious community. Then you have the modernist nationalism in terms of progress and rationality. This can be seen with the Ottoman and Iranian intelligentsia, and culminating in Kemal Atatürk in Turkey and the establishment of the Turkish Republic, and also among the Arab and Iranian intelligentsia. This form of nationalism embraced the European doctrine of progress through science and rational socio-economic organization. It started off with the question of military advance and the importance of science and technology and military organization, and then went on to social and cultural progress. So in fact, the thinkers of the late 19th century, early 20th century, took up the ideas of progress and evolution of Auguste Comte, Alan Spencer, and Emile Durkheim, which became very influential in that context. This kind of thought confronted religion as the main agent of backwardness. They did not dare to say religion as such, Islam as such was the reason for backwardness, but they said it was the corruption of Islam. And in this paradigm, the modern religious reformers in Egypt and elsewhere, such as Fulani and Muhammad Abdul in Egypt at the turn of the 20th century, participated in this ideology, but with ideas of reform religion. In many respects, this kind of paradigm internalized the European gaze on Islam, which saw Islam as being backward, fatalistic, open to sexual corruption, oppression of women, and so on. And so, in this paradigm then, all these elements attributed to Islam were seen as being part of corrupt religion. But the important thing is to enlist Reform Islam in this process of progress through science, rationality, and socio-economic organization. This modernist nationalism was articulated to a range of modern ideologies. So it was with liberal constitutionalism in Egypt in the early decades of the 20th century, to authoritarian corporatism, as it was with the Turkish Republic under Atatürk, to fascism, with the great admiration in the 1930s for Mussolini and Hitler, and most importantly, to leftist communist ideas. They had, throughout all these articulations, the common objectives was national rebirth, the idea, the word Ba'ath, and the Ba'ath party later on was the idea of national rebirth, national independence from colonial and man-made domination, economic development, and military power. Now, in addition to this, they had the modern populist Islamism, that of the Muslim Brotherhood, which started in Egypt in 1928 and persisted throughout until its rise to prominence in more recent times. This was distinct from traditional conservative Islam. It is a social movement with modern organization and mobilization, converging with secular objectives of national revival and anti-imperialism, but with a religious ideology. This has been a constant present on the political fields of the Middle East, but not a dominant presence for most of of the 20th century. But it emerged into much greater prominence in the closing decades of that century and to the present. Now, common to all these forms of nationalism, you have the quest for national cultural authenticity. This is a shared theme in many nationalist ideologies, religious and secular, a kind of cultural nationalism which comes to prominence especially from the 1960s, explicitly a reaction to Western mass and consumer culture. Prominent examples of this are mainly in Iran, with the thinkers such as Jalal Ali Ahmad and better known Ali Shariati, whose ideas became quite important in the run-up to the Iranian Revolution. And within this quest for authenticity and opposition to Western consumerism, I'll come back to that presently, are issues of gender, women, and family. These are major themes. Now I have outlined these different types of ideological articulations. I want to look at key moments in the history of the 20th century which brought about transformations in ideas of nationalism. One, of course, was the Cold War and the Soviet involvement in the region. The so-called revolutions of the 1950s and the 1960s in many of the Arab countries, which were entirely, in fact, military coup d'etats, which toppled post-colonial ancien regime and installed reformist military dictators. So you have Nasser in Egypt is the prototype for this transformation. You have the success of the Ba'ath parties in Syria and Iraq, the FLN in Algeria, in a very different way, the rise of Gaddafi in Libya. And these regimes, notably Nasser, entered into this confrontation with the pro-Western monarchies of Saudi Arabia, Iran until the revolution, and Jordan. But the street politics of these countries, of Saudi, Iran, and Jordan, and North Africa, their street politics were sympathetic to the nationalist regime, in particular to Nasser, after what was seen as his triumph in the nationalization of the Suez Canal and facing up to the attack by Britain, France, and Israel, became a hero of the Arab people for a while. And so his influence and the influence of Egypt was seen by the West and its allies as subversive. In these regimes, statist socialism and the single party on the Soviet model were adopted by Nasser in Egypt and the Ba'ath in Syria and Iraq. They engaged in land reforms and established welfare services and subsidies. And in this respect, not only they utilized Soviet models, but also they were supported in international relations by the Soviet Union, which also became the supplier of arms to these regimes. Within these regimes, you have the dominance of secular nationalism, articulated to a socialist and even Marxism rhetoric. Third worldism, non-alignment, and elements. All these had elements of a kind of universalism and liberationism. At the popular level, the admiration for the kind of iconic figures of the time, Mao, Castro, Guevara, these were the heroes. Nationalism with a universalist component, the liberation of nations and development was seen as the paradigm in which they were acting. In the Cold War context, there was pro-Western encouragement of Islamic opposition to these regimes, particularly through Saudi Arabia. And these regimes, the Islamic element was utilized in this opposition and in the organization of the Islamic parties of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a clandestine party in Egypt at the time. Now, the other important moment on the world stage, regional stage, was 1967, and the Six-Day War and the triumph of Israel against the Arab forces, particularly against Egypt. And this marked a retreat of the Nasserist model. That the successors to Nasser after his death in 1970 were Anwar Sadat, who then changed the policy away from Soviet alliance and dependence into what's called infitah, an opening up of the country and the economy to Western and capitalist forms and influences, realignment internationally to America and the West, and regionally to Saudi Arabia and the oil state. This led to the transformation of these military regimes instated in earlier decades, and was the beginning of this transformation into the dynastic forms that we saw in recent years in Egypt and elsewhere, and the development of crony capitalism. And it's also in this context that Islamism comes into much greater prominence, that Sadat, for instance, utilized the Muslim Brotherhood, which he brought back onto the political scene, as a counter to the left and to the Nasserists. The other key moment in this history is 1979. 1979 saw the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Both of these acted as a stimulus to Islamism, but in different ways. Iran, from the 1950s, had nationalist movement aligned primarily with the left, with the Communist Party being very important and influential in the opposition, or the clandestine, as well as liberal nationalism and social democracy. Islamism was on the margin in this mid-20th century. The turn of sections of this left turned into the ideologies of authenticity, as I've already mentioned. That people like Ali Shariati, the political party that was called the Mujahideen of the People, Mujahideen al-Khalq, they maintained their leftist stances, even some kind of Marxism positions, but they were against capitalism and consumerism, which they saw more in cultural and social terms. The whole question of women, for instance, Ali Shariati, who was westernized, he was a French graduate, he was an admirer of Frantz Fanon, Jean-Paul Sartre, and was associated with Foucault. Foucault, as you know, after the Iranian Revolution, wrote some controversial pieces on defending the Islamic Revolution in Iran and giving it his own interpretations. So in fact, these people were not Islamists in the classical mold. They were much more authenticity Islamists. They saw capitalism and consumerism as subverting the native virtues and the basic cultural motifs. On the question of women, for instance, Shariat, he wrote an essay called Fatima is Fatima, Fatima being the daughter of the Prophet, as a model for womanhood, about women as being having to be active in the struggle for national liberation, for the establishment of a good social order and so on, but not like the women that you see that the West is imposing on the Middle Eastern cultures, the idea of women as a consumer, as fashion and makeup, as being a sexual object. That is a way of subverting the whole society and the culture. So in fact, while not going along with the conservative idea of women back to the home and the kitchen and children, they emphasize the importance of women as activists, but at the same time they wanted them away from this what they saw as the humiliation of consumer culture. Now, the clerical-led movement under Khomeini incorporated the left, including the Communist Party, who saw this as an anti-imperialist struggle. But in the same token, anti-imperialism meant anti-liberalism. The whole question of secularism and of the gender issues were sidelined in favor of supporting what was seen as a national anti-imperialist movement. And of course, as soon as the clerical classes triumphed, then they subordinated, they repressed, and indeed widespread torture and killing of the leftist opposition, which was aided by the war with Iraq over the course of the 1980s. This Iranian revolution had a powerful influence in the Arab world, not one influence, but a number of different influences. In particular, on the Arab left, which the whole rationale of the left, of the nationalist left, was the idea of leading the people, the nation to come to the fore and assert itself. And here was an example of a popular revolution. It did not happen in the name of class struggle, but happened in terms of religion and national authenticity. So this was seen as a model, and many of the Egyptian leftists, some of the people I knew who started off as Marxists and became Nasserists, and when the Iranian Revolution came, they became Islamists. And of course, they remained the same ideologically throughout. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, what happened was it was a stimulus to jihadism, as the case of Afghanistan is well known. That after the Soviet invasion and the start of the Islamic Jihad against the Soviet invasion, this was reinforced, aided by the Americans through Saudi Arabia, and a great many volunteers from different parts of the Muslim world, including many from the Arab world, were enlisted in the fight in Afghanistan. And of course, after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, which is the next point I come to, then these became sort of rogue elements that went back to their countries, notably in Algeria and Egypt, and started jihadist movements against the state of these countries, and in Algeria, resulting in civil war with large-scale massacres. Now, 1989 was the next movement, the next moment, the moment of the collapse of communism and the end of the Soviet model and of Soviet support. This hastened the weakening, if not the collapse, of the left. Nationalism turned to identity politics. Nation, religion, and authenticity became the main factors in some respects, and parallels to Eastern Europe, to Yugoslavia, in which the identity politics, aided by religion, the Catholic Croats, the Orthodox Serbs, the Bosnians didn't have any other identity, apparently, except being Muslims, and so on. There were different strands in the Islamic ideologies that became.
Yeah, you're still going to.
Yeah. In the Islamic politics that became prominent, there was jihadism, the violence of Islamics, as well as the mainstream politics of the Muslim Brotherhood and reformism. Jihadism within Egypt and many of the countries, Algeria, Libya, jihadism was defeated by strong government repression in the course of the 1980s and 90s. So in fact, jihadism became extraterritorial into dodgy states such as Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia, where in the mainstream countries, you can call them this, of Egypt and Algeria and Syria and so on, Islamism became much more peaceful mainstream politics and started to speak the language of democracy and pluralism in some cases, certainly in Egypt. So this brings us to the current moment, the current situation, the so-called Arab Spring. If we look at the general scene in these countries, in the prelude to the uprising, we have there dynastic regimes, heirs to the 1950s revolutions. The 1950s revolutions brought about one-party dictatorships, repression, control, but at the same time a kind of social contract in terms of the delivery of social services, of education, of health, of subsidized food, such as agrarian reforms and so on. All these were gradually withdrawn with the deterioration of this regime into dynastic control. In Iraq, you have Saddam Hussein and his family and his clans ruling over an oil economy with repression as patronage. In Egypt, you had Sadat and then Mubarak, and a very strong case of crony capitalism, immiseration of large sectors of the population, the withdrawal of services. And whenever there were withdrawal of the welfare services, the breakdown of the social contract, the Islamists were the beneficiaries because they stepped in with their charities and networks into providing the services that the state had withdrawn. The opposition to these regimes, there was prominently Islamic. In Egypt, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, in Iraq, the Shiite parties, and secular nationalism and leftism of various kinds was unorganized. In fact, what happened, let's say, in Egypt is that there were a number of legal parties, including leftist parties, but they were not allowed to organize at the popular level. If they tried to organize popular constituencies, say in the labor unions, then they would be very severely repressed. They were okay as talking shops and having a newspaper. Whereas the Islamic opposition could not be so treated because they were part of the mosques and the charities and the various organizations that then could organize politics. So in fact, what you have at present and what you've had really throughout the last few decades is, in Egypt, for instance, very strong organization of the Muslim Brotherhood who are superb at mobilizing people, busing them to whatever event they want to vote or to demonstrate or what have you. Now, the breakthrough in Tunisia and Egypt, and of course when we are talking about, I was interested this morning, there was a workshop on the Arab uprising, and there was nothing but Egypt. There is hardly anything else mentioned. It was all, of course it's very important to Egypt, simply because whereas the events in Tunisia and Egypt have started this chain reaction, elsewhere it's just been stymied, and it ended in deadlock in Syria at the moment, apart from the destruction of the country. We have not an outcome in Libya. It's a mess with different militias and fragmentation of the country. In Yemen, you had the president went with his cousins and sons, and so to continue with the same regime under American and Saudi protection. In Bahrain, it acquired a sectarian form, and then the suppression of dissent was implicitly endorsed by the West and the Saudi aid to the government. So in all these other places, whereas something has happened, what has happened is it's been stymied in one form or another. So really we are talking about Egypt and Tunisia. And Tunisia is the most hopeful because it had been a society with much greater associational life, it's called civil society and so on. Now, these, the kind of the first groups that have made, that started these revolutions, were a new generation of educated middle class, mostly impoverished, but with the skills of electronic communication, breaking the mold of the old politics in terms of affiliations and thought. There's been much talk at this conference about these groups. It was the break of the stagnation that had marked these societies. This is the generation that made the revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, and then stalled in Syria, driven out in the violent polarization between the regime and sundry Islamists. They are struggling with sectarian hegemonies in Iraq and Bahrain. Tunisia and Egypt, the success of the overthrowing the regime, then proceeded into elections, and saw the electoral ascendancy of Islamism. And I've already mentioned how well organized the Islamists were in terms of mobilizing people. But in spite of this mobilization, in fact, in the first round of the Egyptian presidential election, 56% of the electorate voted against the Islamic candidates. And it's only in the runoff that between Morsi and Shafir, between the Islamists and the deep state, old regime, they were almost even. There were a few percentage points between them. So with the nationalism then, what are the ideological twists now? In many respects, the kind of classic nationalism of anti-imperialism, anti-Israel, developmentalism, and so on. These are not issues that have gone away, but they have been sidelined. The current confrontations and contests revolve around questions of Islamization versus secularism, about constitutions, about judiciaries and human rights, about gender and family, sidelining the previously prominent themes in the opposition. But the one thing that in this struggle between Islamism and secularism in Egypt and elsewhere, is the themes of cultural authenticity that I already outlined seem to come to the fore. That one of the important elements in the armory of Islamism is the defense of cultural authenticity, and this becomes particularly prominent in relation to gender and women and women's rights. It was seen a few weeks ago when UN document I'm now quoting from press reports, a UN document demanding global standards to prevent violence against women. And this, the Muslim Brotherhood said, was un-Islamic and would lead to the complete degeneration, degradation of society. The Muslim Brotherhood said that the document includes articles that contradict established principles of Islam and that undermine Islamic ethics if ratified, and so on. So in fact, then the whole question of cultural roots, cultural authenticity, becomes the issue of contention in this. And what is there to be Islamic about in modern places like Egypt, in terms of economic policy, in terms of forms of administration, organization of the state, in terms of international relations? Being Islamic seems to have really very little significance. Where Islamism really matters, and when it comes to the issues of family and gender and the status of women, and when it comes to the question of cultural expression and cultural production, and the censorship over these in the name of preserving respect for religion. And this is what the struggle is largely about at present. Of course, the questions of the economy and the economic problems are absolutely crucial, but they are not a question of Islamic versus secular, because the Islam has nothing new to do beyond what the previous regime had done, and the dictates of the international situation. With that, I'll stop.
Thanks very much.